Yeah, that's a very good question. So I wanted to make the book as global as possible, but it turns out that I couldn't find very many examples outside this rather Western Eurocentric way of looking at things. There's some quite nice examples of social poetry in the Japanese court, and sort of collaborative poetry writing and sharing of poetry. And there are a couple of Chinese examples, but actually they're mostly of sort of sending news reports up to the centre. So I wasn't able to find them, and I just thought, you know what, I'm just going to be straightforward about it and say this is a history of Western media, and I'm not going to pretend that it's global. What then happens, if you look at the way newspapers spread, is that printing presses and the newspaper model, as it had been developed in the West, was transposed into developing countries. So they didn't have the kind of evolution of the newspaper that we had. They went straight to our newspaper model, which of course is now broken. And we've just seen Brazil go over the tipping point. They've got enough broadband now that people aren't buying more newspapers, and newspapers are starting to decline. India, there's still growth because having a newspaper is a sign of literacy, it's a status symbol. But I think we have seen that some countries, some global south countries, some developing countries, have taken to social media extremely enthusiastically. Very often it's because the local media is so terrible. So somewhere like Venezuela would be a good example. Actually, Russia would be another example. Where you have essentially a very untrustworthy, useless media, social media is going to be more popular. You also get this within countries that don't have a language that's shared with somewhere else. So they're more likely to talk to other people in that country, and you'll get strong social networking within that country. But I think it's very much an open question how this will play out. The obvious place to look at is China, because China has a very, very long history of printing and of writing and so on. But the way that the Western internet model has just been sort of dropped in, and they're actually innovating on top of it very quickly. I think it's completely unclear whether the way that the authorities are managing to ride the tiger of social media now is something that's sustainable. The conclusion that I hint at in the book is that it's not, but it may take several decades. It may take longer than we think for the processes, the discussion, the use of social media to sort of erode the respect for the authorities. That's certainly what happened in pre-revolutionary France. We very often get with the startups in China is that they start off being a clone and then they actually innovate beyond that. So Weibo had sort of threaded comments, replies to tweets in effect before Twitter did, and Twitter added it. And I think there are quite a few other things. I mean, you have the 10-cent business model, which is where they sell virtual goods. Could Yahoo learn from that? I don't know. So the idea that all they do is imitate is wrong. They certainly did for a while, but actually there's more innovation going on in China than people give them credit for. So I think Weibo is worth watching, both because of its political effects and what will happen. And it already has. I mean, one of my colleagues at The Economist has described it as a bigger cage. So the population is still in a cage, but Weibo gives them the illusion of some degree of public debate, and so it makes them feel that the cage is bigger, but they're still inside it. But I just wonder whether the sort of practicality of the degree of censorship that they have is sustainable in the long run. Anyway, so it's worth looking at for that political reason, and it's also worth looking at just because there's all sorts of innovative new commercial models coming out of China as well. We had a San Francisco correspondent who wrote a survey of what we now think of as social media, and it was called Among the Audience. And I think it was a survey of new media. So it was a special report in the middle of the paper, 15 pages or something. And this was in about 2005, I think. He was very worried that social media was going to be bad for us because, we are the epitome of the sort of voice of God from the pulpit. This is the way it's going to be, editorial tone. And that's sort of the opposite of what you're supposed to have in social media. But it turns out we have something else which is much more powerful and gives us a much bigger advantage than that disadvantage may prove to be, which is that we're a badge brand. So people like other people to know that they read The Economist. And one of the ways you can do that is you can go to The Economist daily chart, and you can